Thanks for joining me again. I want to begin by acknowledging the devastating flooding in Texas. Our thoughts are with the families and communities affected by that tragedy. One of our fire and rescue team members has deployed to assist with communications efforts in Texas, and our urban search and rescue team is on standby to assist if needed and called upon. Events like this are a reminder of how extreme weather is becoming more frequent and more dangerous. We've seen it here too, with sudden storms, flash flooding, and record heat, underlining how critical it is for us to prepare for extreme weather here at home. We've made major investments in early detection and alert systems to help us better respond to storms and flooding. That includes our flood sensor program, which is now operating across 35 locations in flood-prone areas of the county. These are low-cost solar-powered sensors that monitor rising water levels in real time and instantly alert our emergency teams, paid for through FEMA. Our responsibility revolves around environmental maintenance and the cost of replacement every few years. The flood sensors help us act faster, whether that means warning residents, closing roads, or dispatching first responders. With heavier rains and flash floods happening more often, this kind of real-time monitoring has become essential. We're also a partner in the Maryland Mesonet program, which just installed Montgomery County's first Mesonet weather station last week at the National Capital Trolley Museum. This is a part of a larger statewide system led by the Maryland Department of Emergency Management and the University of Maryland Atmospheric and Oceanic Science Department to build a more accurate and hyperlocal weather monitoring network across the state. We're expecting 4 more Mesonet stations to be installed in the county in the months ahead. And I want to thank the state and the University of Maryland and our emergency management team for making this partnership work. I want to add that Montgomery County is currently mapping and identifying flood-prone areas, and also, more importantly, we're trying to understand how the water flows so that we can make the right fixes as we're experiencing now increased levels of flooding. We need to be able to identify if we have a downstream problem or a problem with our own infrastructure. This is a good opportunity to remind everyone of the importance of having a plan, something the whole family can easily follow to help escape danger and reunite quickly. Prepare a kit for different scenarios that includes being trapped at home or away from home. The best protection is often knowing what to do when a disaster strikes. One of our Office of Emergency and Homeland Security technicians had the idea for the Mesonet system, and it was his initiative that got the ball rolling on this project under the last governor. I'd like you to hear from Matt Mazurko and what he said during my weekly media briefing now.
We've had tremendous success with these. We're noticing that we're able to now anticipate where floodwaters are beginning across the county. We're putting several sensors on individual waterways such as Sligo Creek, Rock Creek, the Hollings River, and even up into some of the smaller streams up towards Little Bennett Creek watershed. And that's very important because now our first responders, our DOT personnel, they're able to understand where heavy rain is beginning to impact our infrastructure across the county.
I want to talk about what we're doing to increase tenant protections in the county. Montgomery County has made some important progress when it comes to rental housing. Last week, a law went into effect that gives Montgomery County the authority to sue landlords in court who repeatedly mistreat their tenants. I want to thank Councilmember Krista Mink for her leadership on this bill and for standing up for renters in our community. This legislation closed a loophole that left too many residents without support. I'm glad we now have it in place. Before this law, we had to rely entirely on state actions or civil action by tenants themselves, even in cases where landlords were blatantly violating basic health and safety rules. Now we can step in directly as a government to hold bad actors accountable. We are protecting people from negligence, retaliation, and unsafe conditions. We've heard from far too many residents over the last years who have felt powerless when facing unresponsive or abusive landlords. This bill gives the county a legal tool to intervene when landlords refuse to meet their responsibilities. Unfortunately, some of our buildings are in horrific shape, and some landlords flat out refuse to make the repairs they need to make. It's frustrating when our residents go through the court system only to have the issue fixed the day before a hearing, and at that time the judges decide there's no fine because the landlord has fixed the problem. That means the landlord gets away with delaying basic services, sometimes for months at a time, and there's no recourse and no compensation to the tenant who lost services. Our Department of Housing and Community Affairs faced significant challenges in enforcing compliance. In FY24 alone, DHCA attempted to recover $1.5 million in unpaid fines, but collected just over $100,000. These landlords often relied on long delays in district court. Some of the worst actors even continued pitching their buildings to prospective tenants as safe, healthy, or luxury dwellings, despite persistent issues. This fix expands the definition of person to explicitly include a landlord. This removes the exemption created for landlords. It clarifies that consumer goods and services now includes rental housing. This means that landlords in Montgomery County are now fully subject to the same consumer protection laws as are other merchants. They must not engage in deceptive, unfair, or unconscionable trade practices. Landlords taking rent money monthly are expected to deliver goods and perform expected services. With the enactment of this bill, the county attorney will be able to bring cases directly to circuit court. This provides the county with new and more robust tools to induce compliance when landlords repeatedly fail to cure housing code violations. Instead of fighting for single citations, the county can now illustrate patterns of deceptive practices. OCP can seek damages, restitution, and other forms of relief. The county will also have the power to seek preliminary, temporary, or permanent injunctions against landlords that show a pattern of property neglect and noncompliance with citations. I want to be clear, this is a very small minority of the landlords who oversee properties in Montgomery County, but it is typical of more than just a few. We have needed this law for a long time, and I hope the fact that it now exists will correct bad actors and bad decisions from happening in the first place. Learn more about our Office of Consumer Protection by visiting montgomerycountymd.gov/OCP. In other news relevant for renters in the county, 2 years ago, the County Council passed legislation that ties allowable rent increases to a formula, 3% plus the rate of inflation, capped at 6%. Last year, we finalized regulations of this legislation, and it went into effect at 6% because inflation rate had been above 3% at that time. For FY26, the inflation rate is 2.7%, and that means landlords will be allowed to increase rents by 5.7%. We put out notice of this rate back in March, but now it's in effect this month, and it's important for all renters and landlords to be aware of this rate change. I've supported rent stabilization for decades, going back to my time on the Tacoma Park City Council. But this bill did not end up where it needed to be. It made progress, but it could have gone farther. Along with Councilmember Juanda Mink, we initially proposed a cap of 3% unless inflation or necessary repairs necessitated a higher rate. The reason we picked 3% is that 3% is higher than the average rent increase over the past 20 years. So it seemed like a safe number given then current rates of inflation. That was a number we believed would give tenants some predictability and protection from sharp increases while still allowing landlords to cover legitimate costs. Where we ended up was a rent cap that would be, in this case, more than twice the inflation rate. And since wages for lower paid workers rarely rise by the inflation rate, it's just going to continue increasing the affordability gap, the gap between what one can afford and what the market rents are. The bill that passed also created carve-outs and exemptions that make it even easier for landlords to raise rents beyond what most tenants can afford. In effect, it watered down the very protections that renters were calling for. For example, apartments less than 23-year-olds are totally exempt from the rent stabilization law. Rent stabilization is an important tool for local governments to utilize to stop rent gouging in high-cost areas. And this is not unique to Montgomery County. DC has rent stabilization, and the city of Tacoma Park has had rent stabilization for over 40 years, where it has been very successful in protecting its tenants. This has a positive impact on student mobility, which improves learning outcomes. I was a teacher in Tacoma Park for many years, and I saw the impact that high rent had on kids in school. Families were forced to move more frequently, which impacted their children. It should be on us to provide as much stability as possible for families to call Montgomery County home and to give their kids the best chance of success in school. These changes help provide that stability. Rent stabilization was validated by the U.S. Supreme Court after World War II, when returning veterans faced rent gouging as they returned home from saving the world from fascism. And they were rewarded for their efforts by landlords seeking to take advantage of housing shortages to jack up rents as high as possible. In response to that, many jurisdictions in the country implemented rent control laws, practical policies that address real issues people face every day. So yes, we're going to enforce the rent stabilization law as passed, but we also are going to be honest about where it falls short, and we're going to continue to push for solutions that reflect the actual needs of our residents, especially our renters. As many of you, we are still processing the impacts on our state and county and country following the federal cuts laid out in the federal budget bill passed last week. First, Maryland's Secretary of Labor is raising serious concerns about the solvency of the state's unemployment insurance fund. That's a real warning sign, and it comes at a time when more people may soon need that safety net. On Tuesday, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration can move forward with its plans to significantly downsize the federal workforce. This will hit communities like ours especially hard, where tens of thousands of people either work directly for the federal government or for contractors. We're already seeing the early impacts of this through buyouts, retirements, and people quietly, or not so quietly, being pushed out. And most of this isn't even reflected in our unemployment numbers yet. Various courts put the brakes on many of the mass firings that the DOJ records had begun to implement, but this most recent court ruling lets those mass firings go forward. So unless the president and his sycophants suddenly realize that they're crippling the government's ability to do its job and decide to pull back on some of those cuts, we're likely to see the feared spike in layoffs actually materialize. Right now, the county's unemployment rate is 3.2% based on the most recent May figures. That's up from 2.6% a year ago and well above our record low of 1.3% that we had in April of 2023. Again, those numbers don't fully capture the job losses in the federal workforce. We should expect things to get worse before they get better. And that's why our investment in workforce support are so critical. In the FY26 budget, we provided additional funding for WorkSource Montgomery to expand its in-person job center in Wheaton and provide more hands-on help for people trying to get back into the workforce. We'll continue to mobilize to grow our Mobilize Montgomery initiative to offer displaced workers access to training, hiring, and events and resources tailored to what's actually happening in the economy. Visit mobilizemontgomery.com for more information. We can't control what's happening in Washington, but we can keep showing up for people who are affected by it here, and that's what we're going to do. There's no way I'm going to use the word beautiful to refer to President Trump's spending bill, which passed Congress last week. This bill will have devastating effects on many of our residents. As someone who's worked on many budgets, I can say I've rarely seen a proposal so short-sighted and damaging. It's a moral and fiscal disaster. And what's maddening is that amongst all the historic cuts in this bill to critical services, this bill still manages to balloon our national deficit to all-time record highs. How the hell do you cut services and still achieve such a record deficit? There's a pretty simple answer. Massive tax cuts for the wealthy and corporate giveaways. This is perverse budgeting. This bill proposes more than $1 trillion in cuts nationwide to Medicaid. Tens of thousands of residents of Montgomery County are on Medicaid. They are low-income families, seniors, and people with disabilities who will lose basic access to health care. Negative health impacts will invariably follow. And here's the rub. The most serious cuts to Medicaid won't take effect until 2027. How clever of them, since 2027 is after the midterm elections. That means Republicans know that this bill is bad news for millions of Americans, which is why they're delaying it so that most of its consequential impacts occur after the election, not before the election. If that isn't a warning sign of what's to come, I don't know what is. Furthermore, this bill would slash SNAP, the nation's most important anti-hunger program, directly increasing food insecurity. Children will go to school hungry, and older adults will be forced to choose between meals and medicine, something that too many people already struggle with. Our nonprofits, our schools, and our food banks are going to be overwhelmed by the needs. Further cuts to the National Institutes of Health and other federal research programs would jeopardize thousands of jobs and destabilize the life sciences and biotech sectors that we've spent years building here in the county. They're a core part of our local economy, a source of high-quality jobs for our residents, and an invaluable pipeline for research for future discoveries and cures. But more than that, we're crippling an agency where discoveries contribute to advances in healthcare, a better understanding of environmental and industrial impacts on health, and the growth of companies that produce cures, which contribute to the economy in a big way. Rolling back support for clean energy, electric vehicles, and climate innovation harms the planet and undercuts our efforts to fulfill our climate action plan and reduce carbon emissions by 100% by 2035. It tells companies that their investments should be made elsewhere, eliminating jobs for generations to come. Amazingly, this bill also increases the federal deficit to over $3 trillion. Why? To pay even more tax cuts for corporations and the wealthiest Americans. It's a pretty despicable reason. What this country needs is investments in people, investments in technology and infrastructure, and in economic growth. Tax breaks to millionaires and billionaires and corporate behemoths do nothing to grow the economy. And when it comes to being short-sighted, that decision to disincentivize and disinvest in clean energy tech, solar, wind, and other clean tech, takes us out of the global race to supply those things. Instead, U.S. manufacturing will get sidelined while the rest of the world looks to consume and produce these technologies. This is a huge and growing market that we're walking away from, and that's just stupid. I'm grateful for the work of our congressional delegation, Senators Chris Van Hollen and Angela Alsobrink, as well as Representatives Jamie Raskin, April McLean Delaney, and Glenn Ivey, for standing up and speaking out against these efforts. That's a wrap for today. I hope you're all hanging in there. I hope you have a great week, and I'll be back again next week. Take care.